The Prime Minister's top aide, Dominic Cummings, is facing calls to resign after travelling more than 250 miles with his wife, who had suspected coronavirus, to be near relatives during the lockdown. Downing Street says that he drove from London to County Durham, where there was family to help with childcare if he also became unwell, and that it was in line with lockdown guidelines. Mr Cummings was unapologetic, saying he'd done the right thing and had behaved reasonably and legally. Cabinet ministers have indicated their support for Mr Cummings, and the Transport Secretary Grant Shapps said he had the full support of the Prime Minister. It comes as 282 more deaths were announced in the past 24 hours. It brings the total deaths in the UK to 36,675. Here's our political correspondent, Ian Watson.
You're supposed to be more than 2 metres apart.
Boris Johnson's senior advisor Dominic Cummings lecturing reporters on social distancing, but his opponents accuse him of breaking the lockdown rules himself. When his wife became ill at the end of March, she and their 4-year-old child didn't self-isolate at their London home, but travelled more than 250 miles to County Durham.
Well, it's a question of doing the right thing. It's not about what you guys think.
The government's guidance on self-isolation says if you live with others and you're the first in a household to have symptoms of coronavirus, then you must stay at home for at least 7 days. But all other household members who remain well must stay at home and not leave the house for 14 days. But in a statement, Downing Street set out to explain why Boris Johnson's advisor didn't stay at home. It was essential for Dominic Cummings to ensure his young child could be properly cared for, it says. His sister and nieces had volunteered to help, so he went to a house near to, but separate from, his extended family in case their help was needed. It added his actions were in line with coronavirus guidelines. Mr Cummings believes he behaved reasonably and legally. Durham police said they were made aware that Dominic Cummings was in the city on March the 31st, and the next day a police officer spoke to his father at his father's request. He confirmed that Dominic Cummings and his family had travelled from London and were self-isolating at part of the property. The police deemed no further action was necessary, but did provide some advice on security issues.
And welcome to today.
So where does this leave the government's stay-at-home guidance now?
Is the advice now to parents that if you don't have your own extended family nearby, even when you are ill with COVID symptoms, you are allowed to leave your home, travel many miles across the country and isolate closer to your extended family?
Look, the important thing is that everyone remains in the same place whilst they're locked down, which is exactly what happened in the case you're referring to with Mr Cummings. So the Prime Minister will have known he was staying put and he didn't come out again until he was feeling better.
But he did travel 250 miles from his London home, did he not?
Ian, the guidance says if you're living with children, keep following this advice to the best of your ability. However, we are aware that not all these measures will be possible, depending, therefore, on circumstances. I'm adding those last few words.
Senior ministers have rallied around to defend Dominic Cummings, but there have been calls for his resignation from some of his opponents.
Dominic Cummings should have done the right thing. He should have resigned. But now that he hasn't, Boris Johnson must show leadership and he must remove him from office immediately.
You know, we've had a lot of people who have been struggling throughout this pandemic and sticking by the rules. We've got care workers moving into care homes, hospital staff in staying in hotels, and they've struggled for not seeing their family. They've adhered by the rules and he's broken them, and it's just so irresponsible.
But tonight, new allegations. Downing Street denied reports that Dominic Cummings had returned to Durham from London last month after he'd recovered. While in The Observer, there's a claim that Dominic Cummings was seen at a beauty spot about 30 miles from Durham when he was apparently self-isolating.
And Ian is here with me now. Ian, lots of outstanding questions tonight for Mr Cummings.
Yeah, well, Labour are trying to now point, Rita, to an apparent inconsistency. A Downing Street statement saying that Dominic Cummings stayed in a property separate from his parents, but nearby in the Durham area. The Durham police in a new statement tonight saying that he was self-isolating on part of his father's property. They're also calling for the top civil servant in the country to launch an investigation. And I think it'd be quite easy to see this as a bit of a Westminster bubble story, bubble that Downing Street will be hoping will burst sooner or later, with allegations and counter-allegations between government officials. But I think the bigger story here is really the credibility of the government's own guidance, because today a cabinet minister said that that guidance can be interpreted so flexibly that it's perfectly acceptable for someone who is ill with COVID symptoms to travel the length of England during the lockdown. Now, the Cabinet's going to be meeting, Rita, on Monday. They're going to be discussing further ways of easing the lockdown. They can only do that if they can keep the virus under control. And it could be much more difficult to keep it under control if, in effect, people start interpreting the guidelines quite as flexibly, perhaps, as Downing Street and start doing their own thing.
Ian, many thanks. Our political correspondent Ian Watson there.